Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carlin Bowman, and I'd like to welcome all of you today and also our C-SPAN audience. It's my great pleasure to introduce my AEI colleague, Michael Barone, and this impressive panel to discuss Michael's new book, How America's Political Parties Change and How They Don't. First, a word about how we'll proceed today. Michael will give a 20-minute preview of the book, and then our panel will respond. We have with us today Amy Walter, the national editor of the Cook Political Report. You see Amy regularly on Politics Monday on the NewsHour, and she's the host of WNYC's The Takeaway with Amy Walter. Like many of you, I read a lot of political commentary each week. Amy is always fair, and what's more, she doesn't follow the pack. She's digging deeply into polls and other election-related data, providing insights that others don't provide. Patrick Raffini is the co-founder of Echelon Insights, one of the most innovative and interesting of the next generation of polling, analytics, and intelligence firms. Patrick was a pioneer in the political digital world, having gotten his start in this business 17 years ago. A recent paper for the 2019 States of Change project looked at how the Republican Party can adapt to demographic change. If you don't read his Friday roundup of interesting stories called The Intersection, you should sign up for it. Like Amy, he provides unique insights onto politics. Sean Trendy is the Gerald R. Ford Visiting Fellow at AEI and a senior election analyst for Real Clear Politics. Sean is a lawyer by training, has an MBA, just finished a master's in statistics, and now he's all but dissertation for his PhD in political science. He likes school. Sean was a co-author of one of the editions of the Almanac of American Politics, the publishing phenom that Michael Barone introduced to the world in 1971. The book tells us about America through individual entries on the politics, the beliefs, and the idiosyncrasies of 535 people in Congress. It's not surprising that reporters consult the Almanac before interviewing members of Congress, because the portraits the Almanac provides are rich, detailed, respectful, and also good-hearted. After Michael speaks, each of the panelists will speak for 8 minutes. Then I'll pose a few questions, but I want to make sure we have time for all of your questions. And at this point, I'd also like to thank Ella Ryder and Jackie Clements for all their help in putting this event together. Just a few weeks ago, Fareed Zakaria wrote a column on the end of one of the world's most successful political parties, speculating, as so many before him have done, on the death of the Conservative Party in England. On our shores, Stan Greenberg sounded the death knell for the Republican Party in a new book entitled GOP RIP. Before and during the 2016 election, many obituaries for the GOP were published. And in what I call the death literature, it certainly isn't one-sided. You don't have to go very far back to find the same kinds of stories about the demise of the Democratic Party after George W. Bush's election. Against what seems to be a growth industry in the death of genre, on both sides of the Atlantic comes this slim but very substantial volume that looks at the longevity of our two political parties. Michael is ideally suited to the task, having deep historical knowledge and perspective. He's actually set foot in all 435 congressional districts, and he's covered politics from all angles as a pollster, a strategist, a journalist, and an author of deeply researched and thoughtful books designed to explain our politics and our country. Our panel today has a Barone-like detailed understanding of historical and contemporary politics, and I know we will have a spirited discussion. Michael, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Carlin, for your kind words, and I want to thank each of the members of the panel here who have come forward. I'm very complimented that three of the very smartest people of the next generation or two of political observers were willing to come and discuss my book, and I'll say that before they have their say on it. As you mentioned, I've been studying with this stuff for kind of a long period of time now. First edition of the Almanac of American Politics, of which I was a founding co-author, came out in November 1971, and that's starting to feel a long time. That was even before we talked about the impeachment of Richard Nixon, okay? That was a long time ago. And I guess I go back, my political memory goes back to growing up in Detroit, once America's boomtown. And the election of 1954, which was a pivotal one. We lived in Ward 22, Precinct 221. As a school child obviously should know, the voting was at our Detroit public school there. And this was a key race between the Republican incumbent congressman in the 17th District, Charles G. Oakman, and Martha W. Griffiths, the Democratic nominee. Martha Griffiths won that seat. She campaigned in a trailer. My mother went to the trailer to meet Martha Griffiths. That was the beginning of 40 years of Democratic majorities in the House of Representatives, with key districts like that Northwest Detroit middle income district being a key thing. So,
and Michigan had 17 districts.
17, 18,
18 districts.
Yeah, that was
That's another.
a long time ago.
Yes.
This was a long time ago. So I've been doing this, and I was inspired to write this book in part by having lived through a number of predictions of the demise of our political parties. And what, fascinates me, and which I think most people don't understand, is these political parties are very old. I mean, the Democratic Party was founded in 1832 to reelect Andrew Jackson and so sustain his veto of the Reed Charter of the Second Bank of the United States. That's the oldest political party in the world. The Republican Party was founded in 1854 to get rid of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and end slavery in the territories. That party both of those parties were successful within a decade or a dozen years of achieving those policy goals, but they've gone on and on. So the Republican Party is the third oldest party. Second oldest is the British Conservative Party, to which Carlin made reference, founded at least by Lord Blake's reckoning in his biography of the Conservative Party in 1846. I guess Fareed Zakaria thinks it's on its way out. I've looked at the recent polling and suggest they're going to win a 58-vote majority if and when Britain ever has another general election in the House of Commons. So these parties, having achieved their early goals within a dozen years, are nonetheless still operating 187 and 165 years after their foundings. And in a time when America has grown from a nation of about 20 million to about 320 million people, we don't have many institutions, aside from churches, that go back that far in America. And so I wanted to make the point that these have lasted a long time, and to argue that that's true for some fundamental reasons. There are some structural factors in our political system that tend to favor a two-party system, the Electoral College for presidential elections, the single-member district, which is not in the Constitution, it's a statute, in congressional and legislative elections. But I think there's something fundamentally more at stake here, fundamentally more causative of the longevity and persistence of these two parties. We've seen the parties change their positions on a whole variety of issues. They've adapted to emerging issues, to new constituencies, to innovative technology, shifts in opinions, world events, new leaders. Take one example. The Democrats started off as the Free Trade Party. The Republicans were for the tariff. By the 1970s or 80s, they've switched positions on that. And with Donald Trump as president, they may be in the process of shifting their positions once again. The Democratic Party in the 19th century was in many ways the limited government party, the party that tended to favor local options. It was a party that was happy to tolerate slavery and segregation in the South and the saloon in the North. The Republican Party was more of a federal government party. So the parties have changed and adapted, but at the same time, and this is the central argument in my book, there has been a persistent basic character, personality, DNA of each of the parties that in my view has been relatively unchanging for 187, 165 years, and which accounts in significant part for their longevity and their resilience. The Republican Party has always been concentrated around a core of constituency of people seen as typical Americans, even though by themselves they are never a majority. The composition has changed over time, but it continues from Yankee Protestants in the 19th century to white married Christians today, but that basic character being centered on a core constituency has continued. The Democratic Party has always been a coalition of outgroups, different groups of people regarded by themselves and others as not typical Americans, but when united, often make up a majority. Andrew Jackson's party was a coalition of Southern whites and Roman Catholic immigrants in the big cities of the North. A good combination if you keep them separate. The Democrats took 103 ballots to nominate a candidate for president in 1924, and that convention, by just 4 votes out of something like 2,000 votes, declined to censure the Ku Klux Klan in a fight there. Today's Democratic Party is a coalition whose most loyal members include unusually religious Black Americans and unusually secular gentry liberals. They are going to work together to impeach Donald Trump, so it appears. But when it comes to Beto O'Rourke's argument of yanking tax exemptions for churches that don't perform same-sex marriage, I predict there's going to be disagreement there between these two groups. And I think these two enduring characters help to explain their longevity. And that has been important in a nation that has always been diverse. I mean, you will hear a lot of commentary that says, well, in the last 3 years or the last 12 years, we've become a diverse country. We have always been a diverse country. The British colonies on the Atlantic seaboard were a diverse group of colonies. And the founding fathers recognized that when they created a constitution that retained power in the states, that provided for freedom of religion, but also said there was not going to be a federal government established religion. You could continue to have them in the states where some of the states wanted to, Massachusetts and Connecticut, while Virginia got rid of its religious establishment. But they recognized, they knew about the religious wars in Europe. They knew that unlike the European countries, the infant United States was a religiously diverse country, and they provided a framework in which we can do that. And my proposition here is that the existence of these two parties, one always concentrating on a core constituency, the other a coalition of selected outgroups, has given a large majority of voters in a always diverse country, diverse economically, religiously, regionally, ethnically, racially, and so forth. A choice, an avenue of expression, a choice that will tend to be congenial to them, and that has accounted for the persistence of our two-party system. It's something that's fundamental about the United States, not necessarily transferable to other countries. And it's something that our two political parties, which like to excoriate each other, and which are both of which are excoriated by many citizens. I've been doing radio call-in shows, and I've been hearing about that. Nonetheless, have performed over time. Now, the question's often asked, why haven't we seen third parties emerge? We've had the example of Ross Perot in 1992 with a reprise in 1996, trying to become a third party using his celebrity as a business person to try and create a third party movement that for a few months seemed to be competitive with Bill Clinton and with George H.W. Bush in general election polling. Donald Trump may have taken a lesson from that since he decided that as a business celebrity and reality TV guy, maybe if you really wanted to be president, maybe you'd be better off seeking a nomination of one of the two major parties rather than going it out as an independent, as Ross Perot had done 24 years before. But could a third party emerge? Well, I think we've had what amounts to kind of a test case of that. I suspect nobody in this room remembers the election of 1912, but I see Judge Williams is laughing at that, but that's okay. We had a pretty clear chest of that in 1912. This was an era when the articulate America was talking about the appeal of progressive ideas. There was a progressive party, and it ended up with a candidate named Theodore Roosevelt, who had gotten the highest percentage of the popular vote of any president just 8 years before, since the beginning of the Republican-Democratic rivalry. So they had a celebrity candidate with proven ability in both national and foreign affairs, a highly competent and media-wise candidate. The Progressive Party ran candidates in a majority of non-Southern congressional districts in 1912 and again in the 1914 election. It looked like a third party was emerging as competitive. What happened? By 1916, the Progressive Party really doesn't exist anymore. In 1918, it's basically gone except for third-party movements in Scandinavian and German-dominated Wisconsin and Minnesota. Theodore Roosevelt's back as a Republican. He's the odds-on favorite to win the Republican presidential nomination in 1920, and if he had not died at age 60, well short of the lifespan of our current presidential candidates, by the way. But if he had not died at age 60 in January 1919, he might have ended up as the four-term Roosevelt president rather than his fifth cousin, whom he always considered somewhat inferior. In any case, that's a pretty good test case for a third party, and it didn't work. I think also both parties have shown their resilience after devastating defeats. Those of us who grew up reading American political history that's been written and well known are very familiar with the Republicans' devastating defeat in the Great Depression of 1932, when unemployment was 25%. Franklin Roosevelt's Democrats won smashing victories in 1932, in 1934, and 1936. To the point that there were fewer than 100 Republicans left in the House of Representatives, and of course people were predicting the demise of the Republican Party. That story has been told vividly by New Deal historians who were aficionados of Roosevelt and who were terrific writers and whose books were bestsellers. It's a familiar story, and yet the Republicans basically come back. They show resilience. By 1940, it's my contention in my earlier book, Our Country, The Shaping of America from Roosevelt to Reagan. The Republicans would have won in 1940 if that election had been decided on domestic issues, and I think the polling shows that that's at least would have been a likely outcome. Instead, you had Hitler and Stalin, allies, seizing control of the landmass of Eurasia when that election was decided, and voters opted to stay with the proven ability and nerve of Franklin Roosevelt. But the Republicans were competitive back on domestic issues by that time. The Democrats' devastating defeat is less well known. I think partly because most historians are liberals and they don't want to talk about the devastating defeat of the Democrats in 1920 after 8 years of the Woodrow Wilson administration. But Wilson's policies proved to be unpopular. He proved to have negative job ratings after he had a stroke and was unavailable to anybody but Mrs. Wilson and his doctor for a period of months and months and months. He didn't have his Twitter feed either. He was, you had Americans involved in continued being involved in military action against the communists in Russia in 1919. You had huge inflation, huge recession, a huge influenza epidemic, which if it came today with this kind of lethality would probably have resulted in about 3 million deaths in the United States. This was a devastating time of uncertainty, and the president's party got only 34% of the popular vote. 4 years later, it was at 27%. The Democrats held on in the South, but not even in all states in the South in the 1920s. And yet the Democrats did make some progress, even though people were predicting they might not last as a party, to try to unite a coalition party, which is always difficult. They had some assistance, of course, in rebounding from the Great Depression in 1932, But I think the evidence is even that absent a Great Depression, the Democrats were going to remain competitive, and they were going to figure out how to meld the politics of Al Smith in the North and various Democratic candidate, his running mate Joseph Robinson of Arkansas in the South. In fact, they did come back. So the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, have both rebounded, have both shown resilience from what seems to be devastating defeat. They've managed to recover. Today, of course, we're facing what I call polarized partisan parity. Both parties are about the same size. They're competitive in elections. 30 years ago, beginning of the 90s, we were told the Republicans had a lock on the presidency. They won 5 out of 6 times. The Democrats had an eternal majorities in the House of Representatives. They held it for 40 years. Then you get a couple baby boomers named Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich come along. The locks are broken, and since then the Democrats have won more presidential elections than the Republicans. The Republicans have won House majorities more often than the Democrats. But they've been close races, much closer than in the period of Democratic domination of the House and Republican domination of the presidency. So we've got a lot of discord. We've got a lot of negative feelings. I think, however, looking past some of the controversies of the day, that history tells us that there will be, we're going to continue to have the Democratic and the Republican parties probably around for a long time. Sometimes it takes one or the other of them some period of time to adjust to new issues, new personalities, new events. The political marketplace, like the economic marketplace, is not without its market failures. Some would say it has many more, but it's one that has continued to work over time. So I would just recall in conclusion, if you go back to the 1950s, there was a committee of eminent political scientists, academics, that said that our party system is not really very rational. We have all these liberal Republicans and we have conservative Democrats. Wouldn't it be more rational to have one clearly liberal party, one clearly conservative party? One suspects most of these political scientists were liberals and thought the Liberal Party would win most of the time, but they genuinely believed this. And in fact, I've got chapters in this book about the disappearance of the liberal Republicans and the disappearance of the conservative Democrats. Well, today their prayers have been answered. And the political pundits and the political scientists think it's just terrible. So there's some ways you just can't go pleasing academics, but with that view anyway. There's other things in the book, but I will leave to my colleagues further commentary. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Michael. That was a wonderful introduction to the book. It's, as I said, slim and substantial, so it'd make a wonderful holiday present looking forward. We're now going to turn to the successor generation, and we'll go in alphabetical order, starting with Patrick. Your comments and thoughts about Michael's thesis.
Well, thank you. I first want to thank you for writing this book. I mean, it really brought me back to reading Our Country, which is still on my desk. It's still like
you and my mom.
It's still an essential history, and you've brought over the years, certainly to life, this vivid, textured patchwork of demography that has shaped the results of elections in the 19th and 20th century, demography including regional diversity, religious, ethnic, racial diversity as well, but ethnic diversity being obviously something that the definition of which has changed over time. We have had, certainly elections and swings in elections decided, by which country in Europe people were born in, and now that looks different, but the fundamental principle remains the same. Part of this is, I do fear a little bit that we are losing a little bit of that texture in the electorate, as it seems that we are headed to what seems like this national political monoculture, that kind of pits, urban versus rural, of two perfectly sorted parties where there is very little complexity and texture, maybe a little bit of some texture still within the Democratic Party, but still probably a little bit less texture within each party coalitions than we had in the past. But I hope you'll have something to say here that proves that wrong. So I want to talk a little bit about this era of that Michael calls polarized partisan parity. This idea of, we seem to be stuck in at least somewhat of a deadlock. We seem to have this pattern that despite all the pundit predictions that reasserted itself in the last election of 8 years of Democratic control in the White House, followed by 8 years of Republican control, followed by 8 years of Democratic control, and we will see next year if that pattern holds up, followed by a tendency, not universal, where you still have the Democrats still have a chance, but certainly a slight Republican lean in Congress, in the Senate, but particularly mostly having controlled the House since the 1994 Gingrich Revolution, with the Democrats having mostly won the popular vote for the presidency, but not having consistently controlled the White House in that time. And I think your book really clearly demonstrates all the guardrails that used to exist and all the from the civil rights sort of realignment that occurred with conservatives in the South and liberals in the North kind of switching sides, with things such as the demise of the seniority rules in the House, which kept these old bull Southern committee chairmen in line and which kept rising, aspiring politicians in the South, almost uniformly Democratic, who could, go into these safe seats that they would hold for life and eventually become committee chairmen out of. And, the fall of brokered political conventions. All of these were things that were finally mostly dismantled by the 1970s, but didn't really work their way out of the system until the 1990s, when the incumbency advantage for those who had grown up under the system was sort of swept away by the 1994 Gingrich Revolution. And everything ever since then kind of bears out what I kind of like to think of as the efficient market hypothesis of politics, where all the sort of ideological friction and transaction costs, all the horse trading that happened within the parties has gone away, and our partisanship now predicts our views on policy much more cleanly than it ever did. It predicts who will vote for president. In 2012, 93% of Republicans voted for Romney, 93% of Democrats voted for Obama. That was a high watermark in terms of partisan voting for the presidential nominees. In 2016, no state voted differently for Senate than for president. So bit by bit, the guardrails that have moved the parties from being kind of these social clubs a little bit, and the kind of characteristics of social clubs, and into pure ideological vehicles have been removed. Now, I think we've spent a lot of time bemoaning that fact, and the sort of the decline of civility and the polarized nature of politics, especially in Congress, since again that 1994 election, which saw the Republicans break a 40-year spell of Democratic control. And ever since then, what have we had? We have had the rebirth of partisan media, which was clearly not something new, was a major factor in American politics. Look what they were saying about in the 1800 election, nothing like what the Russians were saying in the 2016 election, I can tell you that. In terms of vitriol and in partisan hatred. But we're somewhat muted in the 20th century by the growth of broadcast media, with the rise of the 3 television network, by the rise of the Voice of God sort of network anchor that kind of standardized media coverage across the country, but still heavily mediated media coverage, where it's hard for partisans, necessarily, not the same partisan media of today. Now, fast forward to the 21st century, that breaks down, and we have the rebirth of partisan media thanks to the internet and cable news. So I'm somewhat pessimistic, right, about having seen the impacts of these media ecosystems, particularly within the Republican Party, in terms of getting, the incentives are very much such that Republican members of Congress, to a large degree Democratic, and we're starting to see with the rise of the AOC type primary challenge, that certainly they're very incentivized, regardless of what they personally want and believe as members of Congress. They're very incentivized to vote and behave in ways that their particular voters, as amplified by the partisan media echo chambers, want in their parties. And that's very different, it seems to me, than the type of politics we had up to the middle of the 20th century, which was a very regional politics, which was characterized with this ethnic patchwork, this patchwork of different religions, ethnicities, different rivalries. It did turn out to be the case, and did come to be the case, that cities turned out to vote more Democratic, while rural areas tended to vote more Republican. That's not too different than what it was today. But that was replicated on each of the regions throughout the country kind of, had this same structure. And you had, states as a result at the state level with this same mix of city and country were pretty competitive for the most part outside of the South. In 1960, even with the massive demographic upheaval of the Kennedy candidacy and the fact that you have 4 in 5 Catholics voting for the Democratic presidential nominee as the first Catholic to hold the office of president, even so, in that upheaval, you see most of the big states throughout the Northeast decided by 10 points or less, being relatively up for grabs. In 1976, 40 states were competitive in one form or another. Fast forward to the 2000s, when I worked on the George W. Bush campaign, we considered 18 states competitive. Now that list is no more than 10. And it's no more than 10 because, to use a kind of Charles Murray metaphor, where you had kind of throughout where you had little Belmonts and little fish towns scattered throughout regions throughout the country. Here now we seem to have one big Belmont and one big fish town. A country polarized and divided by culture. You have throughout the coasts and throughout the Northeast, the West Coast, certainly entire states, dominated by urban cores that make it very difficult for any Republican at any level to compete, where as a result, lots of Democratic votes are wasted in the Electoral College, where it does no good from an electoral college standpoint for Hillary Clinton to win California by 2-1. As a result, much of the rest of the country, the majority of states and the states with the majority of the Electoral College votes actually moving in the opposite direction in this new political alignment, which has created a potential for continued disconnect between the popular vote and the Electoral College. But this sorting is national in character. The economic and educational sorting that we have seen, the fact that, kind of moving forward, the Democratic strategy until maybe to, where, particularly with urban areas having moved so far Democratic in the 2016 election and that being reinforced in the 2018 election, you're having big states like Texas potentially at least discussed tangentially as swing states or target states of the future, much sooner than we maybe thought that would be the case. And it's based on the shift of educated white voters in the presence of very large metros. These very large metros in the South, like places like Dallas and Atlanta, behaving more and more like their counterparts in the North. Less and less regional variation. To the extent that there's regional variation, you can just kind of look at the national statistics and you look at the statistics on the number of degree holders, and there's very little there's less distinctiveness about these particular areas. They seem to be sort of the national dynamic in microcosm. You had in the 2016 election, by the county level, 2/3 of the swing from the 2012 election could be explained purely by government statistics, census data, health statistics, statistics about education, maybe a little bit about by how Democratic they had voted in the past. Very few local factors in that race, the exception maybe being the Mormon revolts, mini revolt against Donald Trump, the fact that a third-party candidate gets 22% in Utah. But overall, the swing in that election very much explained by this sort of the cleavage among whites by education. And accordingly, I think at the level of the individual partisan, issue positions becoming more and more correlated with party affiliation over time. Economic perceptions since the late Bush administration or early Obama administration have been guided by partisanship, such that it's unclear what the political cost would be to Donald Trump if there were to actually be a recession, if his base continues to believe that he had no role and no part in it. The range of political job approval shrinking with every successive presidency, with the exception of 9/11, such that in the Donald Trump White House, the trend line looks pretty flat in terms of job approval, and impeachment has not budged his job approval number by a single percentage point.
Just 1 minute, okay?
Okay. So to conclude, I think the only, and this was actually the conclusion. If party now equals ideology, I think one thing you might be able to do as an enterprising political leader, somebody with a background in business, might be to change what the definition of the ideology means, and to get basically your partisans on board with that. And so we saw conservatism maybe used to mean more about, used to mean national defense, used to mean free markets, used to mean traditional family values. Now it means America first. It means controlling illegal immigration. It means stopping political correctness, sort of the Trump basket of issues. Those issues sort of become more prominent. The party gains votes and loses votes as a result of that. But you're seeing essentially everything falling into line with that, but potentially a movement towards controlling sort of this ideological definition rather than sort of engineering the shifts based on changing demographics or changing these sort of local differences that we used to see in the past.
Thank you, Patrick. Sean?
So just a little aside to start with, the political science literature that Michael referred to about wanting partisanship, they actually named them responsible parties. You can ask yourself how responsible these hyperpolarized parties are really behaving, and that tells you a lot about the political science literature I've been reading over the past few years. Anyway, so there's a few things in life that I genuinely find terrifying. When I was a small child, I wandered into a wasp's nest, so stinging insects, clowns, which I don't think I have to explain, and then what Carlin asked me to do a couple weeks ago, which is to respond to Michael Barone. I'm not a stranger to responding to people smarter than me. That's most of the time. But I am a stranger to responding to people who have accidentally forgotten more about elections than I've ever known. And that's kind of the task today. So what I think I'm going to do a little instead is to take some of the genuine, it's also tough because this book is right. The parties are supple and adapt over time. And I think part of the reason that there's this cottage industry in, this time it's really over, is because people just want to believe it. Like those books sell. And I think especially on the progressive side, there is an implicit commitment to this idea of progress, that there is a promised land ideologically we're getting to around the corner, and the GOP is going to go extinct, conservatism will die soon, genre kind of fits into that ideological standpoint. But the truth is, we're really, really bad at predicting what the directions of the parties are going to be because they're so adaptable and responsive. And so to kind of illustrate this, I would ask people to go back in time, I guess now 94 years to 1925, and imagine we're having this discussion about demographics and where the country is going. And you would take it to the bank that the Democrats were just doomed. The only time they'd won the presidency recently was when there was this split between the progressives and the GOP. And there had just been another split between the progressives and the GOP in 1924, and yet the two parties combined for about 65% of the vote. The Democrats got about 35% of the vote this time. But you would also look at demographics, and I would stand here and say there are three things you can absolutely take to the bank. The first is that African Americans are always going to vote Republican. Okay, and you're seeing this first migration northward. It's going to increase the Republican standing in the north, lock the Democrats out. Relatedly, I would tell you the South will always be Democratic. It had been Democratic since the Civil War. That was not going to change. And finally, I would say working class whites, white ethnics, had come around to the GOP. The Republicans had carried Manhattan in 1920 and 1924, the first time in that party's history, precisely because they had increasingly appealed to the recent round of immigrants. And I would say, taking this all together, the Democrats are just doomed. And as Rick Perry might say, oops. That joke has like 3 more years on it, so I have to use it as often as I can.
Yeah.
By 1928, the prediction about the white working class would be wrong because the Democrats responded by nominating Al Smith, actually flipping Rhode Island and Massachusetts, which at the time were seen as rock-ribbed Republican readouts. I actually didn't plan that alliteration. That worked nicely. The next thing to go would be African Americans. And that would shock people because the 1924 Democratic Convention had deadlocked over whether to condemn the Ku Klux Klan. And yet, Herbert Hoover in 1932 was the last Republican to carry the African American vote. We don't have exit polls, but the estimates are that FDR won about 70% of the black vote in 1936, and it really hasn't dipped below that very frequently since then. And finally, by 1956, the South would cast a majority of the popular vote for a Republican for the first time since the end of Reconstruction. And what's interesting, this is something Michael alluded to, is that only one of those changes can be directly attributed to the Great Depression, the shift of African American voters from Republican to Democratic. The switch of the South was in part because of a reaction to the movement of African American voters, but also the South became wealthy, began voting like wealthy Northerners did, and of course the shift of white working class voters preceded it. So within 34 years, all of my predictions would just be wrong, like dead wrong. In 1976, the AEI scholar Everett Carl Ladd wrote after that election that there was not a single positive sign for the GOP to be had as the Democrats had become the everyman party. And again, this was a very astute observation. Young boomers, which were this should all sound familiar, young boomers who were this giant mass of voters waiting to come into the electorate had swung Democratic. George McGovern had carried the 18 to 24-year-old population, and the young voters were the reason that Jimmy Carter managed to win his election in 1976. Older voters voted for Gerald Ford, and yet 1980, things suddenly looked very good for the Republicans. In 2008, a book came out, 40 More Years, predicting after the election of Barack Obama that Republicans would be in the wilderness for 40 years. 2 years later, the Republicans had the best midterm election for any party since 1938. The truth is that parties are supple and resilient. They are very good, better than we would expect, at identifying facts on the ground and responding to them. And not only that, and this is something that I don't think gets enough credit, but the voters are often better than the people who run the parties at identifying where things go. This is something that I will attribute to Jay Cost, my fellow AEI scholar, who told me in 2008, it's really amazing that in this horrible environment for Republicans, both parties' voters have responded rationally and in opposition to what the party elders wanted. The Democratic base realized this is a great opportunity. We're going to elect, the more progressive candidate, nominate him, Barack Obama. And there were a lot, especially of the old New Democrat types, who were really kind of really scared that he was going to blow the election. He won by 7. At the same time, the Republicans nominated the most moderate candidate they had running in this horrible environment. And in my view, in doing so, kept it from being a 12 or 13 point Republican loss by going with someone like John McCain. Of course, the most the biggest example would be Donald Trump in 2016. I was convinced in February or March that Donald Trump was heading towards a Goldwater-style blowout. And I think a lot of people up here probably had similar thoughts. Now, if I had to debate it, I'm unsure that any other Republican in that race could have won the election. I think Marco Rubio might have gotten a higher popular vote share, done a little bit better with Hispanics, maybe won Colorado or Nevada, but that wouldn't have gotten the Electoral College win if he couldn't have flipped some of the upper Midwestern states that Donald Trump had the unique appeal to, something that I certainly did not see, but a lot of Republican primary voters saw. As a final kind of off-topic, quickly shifting gears thing, it's an interesting observation in this book. You know, a lot of political science models and the models that we generate when we're trying to predict elections, and this ties in with what Patrick was saying a little bit, are economic models. You know, it's the old saw that people vote their pocketbooks. But in truth, if you go back, our data only go back to the 1950s on this stuff. Before that, you don't have very good polling, and the economic data that we rely on are spotty. If you go back before that, though, elections like 1908, where Republicans held on to power handily, despite the fact that we were right after the Panic of 1907, don't really fit the mold. The 1910 midterm elections don't fit that mold. Elections like 1819 or 1876, where we were in really bad depressions, don't fit that mold. And one of the observations this book has is that for most of the time that data have been collected was a time period where a majority of the electorate had living memory of the Great Depression and World War II that followed it. And it's just like a little light bulb in the head. You know, the models haven't been as good recently, and people have said maybe it's polarization. We've noticed that, you know, Donald Trump's job approval doesn't move. But what if it's just the fact that, what if all these models we built up were really measuring that we had kind of a unique event in American history that people remembered? And now that that has kind of passed from our collective memory, these economic models are about to fail. That's something that keeps me up at night now, or will keep me up, and it's a really astute observation from this book.
Amy.
That was a really excellent point. I'm writing that down. Hi. I'm Michael.
Hi.
Do you remember we used to work right next door to each other? So I have very good memories, National Journal, and the Cook Political Report back in the olden days. And I would literally read, I don't think I read it cover to cover, but I spent a lot of time in the Almanac of American Politics. And what made it come alive, I mean, I'm a dork. I'm the person that as we drive anywhere in this country, I tell everybody in the car what congressional district we're driving through, so I'm not totally
of
normal.
Course you would.
Yes, of course. So that's not the most normal thing. But even somebody who's not obsessed with politics could find within each of the chapters that Michael wrote some incredibly interesting fact and understanding about that part of the country. It's why I used to cover the House exclusively, and I loved covering the House. I find it much more interesting than anything else going on in Washington, in part because of what Patrick called sort of the texture, right? Each one of these districts has something unique about it that put it all together, and that's America. And I learned more about America by interviewing House candidates than in any other experience I could have had in covering politics, because each of them brought their regionalism, but also their brand of what that party was. And I have this great image, and this is, we've all been sort of bemoaning the lack. I'm going to keep stealing texture from you, because this is what made politics to me so much fun, was that within the parties, you had different brands of liberalism and conservatism, and you brought a regionalism to Washington when you came from whatever part of the country. And so I remember very explicitly in the 90s having back-to-back interviews with two Democratic candidates. One was a guy named Ronnie Shows, who was running for Congress outside of Jackson, Mississippi. So really pretty rural, exurban Jackson, Mississippi. He had been the commissioner of roads. And when I asked him what his issue was, what he's running on, 4-lane highways. That was it, 4-lane highways. That's what he'd done, that's what he was gonna bring. People in my district need to go to Jackson for jobs. They can't do it if these roads are bad. That is my entire message. And to be fair, I had a hard time understanding him. I needed like an interpreter. His accent was really that thick.
These
Like,
subtitles.
oh, I mean, right? So I get out of that meeting and it really is, it's just like, just pure infrastructure, economic issues. I don't remember exactly where he stood on a whole bunch of other social and cultural issues. I can believe that he was probably supportive of gun rights, much more conservative on social issues. Okay, fine. By the way, he does end up winning. But then literally the next minute, I meet a guy named David Wu who was running in suburban Portland, Oregon, who was a Taiwanese immigrant who, because he was bored at Harvard Law School, dropped out. Or maybe he was bored, I can't remember if he was bored in medical school, then he dropped out and went to law school. And he was a software attorney, okay, in the burgeoning software industry, obviously Intel, all of those companies out in suburban Portland. And so he was talking all about the information superhighway. Literally, it was all about free trade. It was all about new technologies and how it was going to impact the economy. Two people, same party, very different agendas that they were going to bring to Washington. That's what made covering politics so much more interesting. Now, you're going to find mostly candidates from the two parties that represent, if they're not, they may be regionally different, come from north, south, east, or west, but they're going to represent the kind of constituencies and the issues that are very generic. And it's not just a East Coast, West Coast, and then everybody in between. As Patrick pointed out, this is becoming much more about the kind of place you live, not the region of the country in which you live, which feels really different than other times when we've been geographically polarized, as we always have, as Michael pointed out. We've always found a way to be divided in this country, polarized in this country, but a north-south division was pretty clean. Now it's driven by density. The denser the area you live in, whether that is Dallas, whether that is Denver, whether that's Orange County, California, you are more likely to be voting Democratic. The less dense, whether it's rural South, rural Maine, or North Dakota, you're going to be voting Republican. And so what do we also know about those regions? The more dense areas, right, are usually urban metroplexes. Their economy is driven pretty much by the quote-unquote new economy, the information economy. What are the more exurban rural areas driven by? Agriculture, energy extraction, manufacturing. The agendas of those two Americas, normally they can fit together pretty easily if you have a party, if in the party system, you have representatives of both of those economic models working together, right? So you have Democrats from ag-based areas communicating with Democrats from big cities. And they together can create an agenda that does not exclude one portion of the country. Now, those folks are no longer there. They're not the farm state Democrats, they're not the suburban Republicans. And as such, I think that is helping to explain how we got to this place of polarization, again, that is driven as much by, it's not just even pure ideology, but is the sense that everything around me, I understand, that's my worldview, and there's nothing else that is helping to, in Washington at least, to help broaden that, right? That's fine for me as a constituent. I don't need to understand the economic or cultural views of people all the way across the country or in different parts of the country than I am, different kinds of communities. But the political system should be able to balance that, and it's broken down there. Overall, though, I want to, in talking about the parties, I agree with everybody up here about the resilience of the parties and their ability to be, to transform and as such stay relevant. But I will make this point. I think that the political parties are dead, but partisanship is alive. And by that I mean the political parties in the way I see them, as campaign operators, okay? Their influence on campaigns and their influence on what the party does agenda-wise. The parties used to be the gatekeepers. They determined who was going to be the nominee and who wasn't. Now those are the primaries. The primaries allow who to make the decisions. In some ways we said this was great, right? The progressives said this was important. We don't want to have closed doors, smoke-filled rooms determining who gets to be chosen to these offices. We're going to let the people decide. Well, now the people who decide are the most liberal or the most conservative. Turnout in primaries is ridiculously low. In House primaries, it's something like 5% turnout. So the people who are being elected to Congress, right, we started off by talking about this political parity, right? So most districts are really red or really blue. They are being determined in a primary, and the people who choose those folks are not choosing the person who happens to be someone who is, let's say, the more moderate. And I don't just mean in ideology, I also mean maybe in temperament, okay? The person who's going to get the most attention is going to get the most votes by people who are the most invested in turning out to a primary. They're also no longer the gatekeepers for money. There was a time when it was really hard to raise money as a presidential candidate if you didn't have the party behind you and the party apparatus behind you. They closed as many doors as they wanted and opened as many doors as they wanted to big donors. That's gone. In part, you don't have the soft money ban with McCain-Feingold was incredibly helpful for people who wanted to run as outside parties. I remember very explicitly meeting with a party campaign person in the soft money days when a party could coordinate with campaigns, who said to a candidate, this is not your race to lose. This is our seat. This is the Democrat seat. It's not your seat. I will determine whether you lose that or not. I'm going to spend money there how we, as the party, want to spend money because it is our seat. Well, now you see Bernie Sanders has raised more money and has more cash on hand than the former Vice President of the United States of America, Joe Biden. Bernie Sanders is not raising money with the party apparatus, right? So
Not a Democrat.
he's not a Democrat either, which goes to the third point, which I think most folks up here have made. And Michael made this point about, will there be a third party president? I would argue there is a third party president. His name's Donald Trump. And I don't mean that to be facetious. Honestly, he was not a traditional Republican in any sense of the word. He had been many different parties before he was a Republican. And yet, here we are. Not only did the party embrace him and vote for him to win the election with 90 whatever percent of the Republican vote, but he continues to have a hold on the Congress and voters with a Democrat, on the Republican side, despite the fact that his style, the positions that he takes, almost everything he does goes against some core, what we thought were the core values of that party. And Bernie Sanders falls into that same category. He's not a Democrat. And not that long ago, Democrats would have said, bye-bye. I mean, this is what the controversy was about in 2016, right? In another era, the fact that Democrats put a thumb on the scale, the DNC put a thumb on the scale for Hillary Clinton would be, of course they did. She's the Democrat. That's what we do. We support people who are Democrats. We don't need to support all these other people here just because they want to use us as a platform. And that goes to the other piece here about who drives the platform. again, it used to be the party, right? The party platform was done at the convention with delegates of the parties. I don't know the last time anybody read a party delegation. There's still fights over it, which are always, to me, really silly because they don't matter. But the individuals now drive the policy of the parties. And again, technology plays a big role in this. The fact that a freshman member of Congress named Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from New York has more influence on the agenda, or at least she has the agenda.
She won 14,000 votes.
14,000 votes, and we're talking about her issue set more than anything else that's going on in the Democratic Party, right? It's pretty remarkable. Now, to be fair, the way the party system does work, or let's just say this, the system within Congress works, the speaker still has control of what gets to the floor. That said, she has controlled what's getting into people's TV sets, computers, Instagram, whatever, much more so than Nancy Pelosi was ever able to do. Technology has changed the way that we see institutions, and so institutions are either fading away or they're going to have to evolve. So I do think that the parties themselves have become less important in determining a lot of these issues, but the partisanship is more important than ever because those are now the cues we use to understand our world, right? Gosh, this is really confusing issue. I'm hearing all of this back and forth, or is this right or is that right? Who's telling me the truth, who's not? Oh, a Democrat's telling me that? Okay, I believe it. Oh, a Republican's telling me that? Okay, I believe that. If you see this all the time in polling. You ask a question of folks, say, if you knew X, Y, and Z, would you support that? Of course. You ask another set of people that same exact question, but put the name Trump in it, or put the name Obama in it. Oh, suddenly, opinions of that issue change dramatically. Has absolutely nothing to do with the underlying issue that's driving us. So I'm happy to open it up to questions and comments, but I do think we're all sort of at this place trying to figure out, I agree with Michael that what do we do in a party, or in a country that's as polarized as this? Well, guess what? We've been as polarized as this time and time again, and the country evolves. That we are a country that is incredibly resilient, and we find a way to see whatever the other side is. It's just while we're in that moment, it feels incredibly uncomfortable, and there's no easy way to say, oh, I can tell you where we're going to go on the other side.
Thank you very much, Amy, and thank you to all of the panel. It's actually time for your questions. We only have about 15 minutes left, and we'd like to invite all of you to a wine and cheese reception afterwards where Michael will sign books. And we have a question already over here.
Hi. Are we a political realignment?
Well, we're always in political realignments, but it's actually, you look at the difference between 2000, 2004 presidential election. 3 states switched their electoral votes. The other 47 stayed the same. I think we're in less of a period of realignment and more of a period of polarization, where, to somewhat of our surprise, the kind of key electoral vote changed in 2016, which few people anticipated. I think Sean Trendy is one of those that did, writing in 2013 or 14, as I recall. Was the outstate Midwest, an area declining in demographic percentage of the country, an area that has not, whose texture most political actors have forgotten, and which some of them took unduly for granted. And it's which, I think that there's relatively little change. We saw many more votes change between elections in the 1960s and 70s, and I talked about the 1920s and 30s, than we see today. this is not going to stay this way forever, but how many voters are switching between 2016 and 2020?
We're just coalescing, we're not realigning, right? So you're taking areas that maybe once went 55-45, and now then they went 60-40, and now they're 70-30.
Well, we
right?
heard, we had the last two presidents were reelected with 51% of the vote, sparking claims that we were headed towards a Republican natural majority and then a Democratic natural majority. Neither claim so far has been vindicated.
Question?
I do think some of the shifts are, I'll be brief so we can get more in, but there are some underrated big shifts going on underneath the stability. You know, West Virginia, Bill Clinton carried it by 13 points. Donald Trump carried it by 50. Nevada has gone from a state that, you know, was seen as something Democrats had a tenuous hold on in the 80s and 90s to one that's, you know, seen as increasingly blue. Texas, I think, I think the shifts there are the real deal. But yeah, these realignments are not the realignments you learned about in undergrad. They're more localized or regional.
Question here in the back.
Should we draw any inference from the fact that the parties are themselves less popular and that independents or people who say none of the above are increasing in number? That's enough.
Yeah.
My answer is no. We actually, I think polling data is pretty clear that lots of people who say they are independents go in and vote for Republican up and down the line or Democratic up and down the line. And, you know, they like to say, well, I'm independent. I think about the character of the man. But they really are one party or the other, the large majority of them. And some states you get called an independent if you don't register in a party to vote in a primary. As Amy says, primary turnout's low. So, you know, they might better be called indifferents rather than independents.
I think also that people are less willing to, I think you have a point, though, about people less willing to identify with party, in part because we've seen this rise, something we call negative partisanship, right? Folks are identifying with party less because they say, oh, I love the issues or the ideology of my party, but I hate the other side, right? It's driven by dislike. Why are you a Republican? I dislike Democrats. Why are you a Democrat? I dislike the Republicans. A lot of people who call themselves independents don't feel comfortable calling themselves a Republican or Democrat, even if they vote 100% of the time with that party, because at their core, there are still big problems with that party. It's either too conservative, not conservative, too liberal. It doesn't mean that they're moderate. It just means that whatever is going on in this party that has now become like this big blob, right? What is the Democratic Party? What's the Republican Party? It's all these different tentacles. I don't really know what it stands for anymore, but I don't like the Democrats, so I'm going to vote for the Republican.
So there was recently an analysis that looked at the intersection of independents, moderates, and undecided voters. It was no more than 2% of the American public.
Question back here, and then up at the front.
Alex Pollock of the R Street Institute. Thanks to the panel, and thanks, Michael, based on your comments and on reading the first page of the book. It looks terrific. I love the discussion that you all made about the surprises, the bad predictions, especially by the academics, and this makes me think of my own field, finance, which predictions are universally bad. And it seems to me maybe the two domains actually share a lot. They're both markets. They're both based on expectations of behavior and predictions of behavior, which in fact create other expectations and change actions, and the result makes it highly unpredictable. Does that seem like a fair comment?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, typically perceptive, Alex. I think, yeah, I talked about the political marketplace as well as the economic marketplace. They both have market failures, and we both have problems making predictions that are always true.
Question here, and then we need some questions from the other side of the room.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask about the process, the change in this period from the way in which districts are shaped and designed, the sophistication with which that process is done, and the result seems to be that there's less willingness to compromise when you come to the House.
I think the problem is more with the voters than with the districts. You know, Democrats for 40 years didn't have any problem with redistricting when it favored their party. Now we suddenly hear that it's a violation of democracy, that it's terrible, that people are choosing their, you know, the candidates are choosing their voters and so forth. My view is that the regime that the Supreme Court sort of seems to be adopting is that if you would force people to adhere closely to the population guidelines, equal population of each district, a party designing districts, and this includes some of these so-called independent commissions, which tend to be gamed by the Democrats. You know, we're going to have neutral political scientists devise this. Yeah, how many neutral political scientists are there? Come on. Is that you eliminate, the party cannot benefit itself so much that it's invulnerable to challenge within the 10-year period between the census. And I can cite you numerous examples going back. I've studied this with the 1960s cycles, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010, in anticipation of the 2020s. So I've been through this a little bit, and I've actually designed districting plans myself. So, you know, we're now going to a regime of more of these independent commissions in states, which will still favor one party or the other, usually the Democrats, not always. That, you know, that the fact is that any party that has overwhelming support in the very dense areas is going to be at a disadvantage in an equal population, single-member district plan, because no matter how convoluted you draw the lines, and you can look at the Illinois Democrats' lines in the last round of redistricting, or the Maryland Democrats' lines, as well as Republican plans, you can't benefit yourself all that much. You can't benefit yourself all that much. The party that wins districts with 58% is going to get more districts than the party that wins districts with 88%. And that's a rough description of where the demography is now. If I was advising the Democratic Party on this or the Electoral College, one thing I would say is, guys, you may want to talk about changing the Constitution. That's kind of a difficult process. Or you may want to, you know, create independent commissions, which may not do what you want. What you really ought to do is try and pitch your party a little more towards people in these non-dense areas where you seem to, which you used to get, you know, 44% of the votes in, and now you're getting 28% of the votes. Maybe those people are hitting the donkey over the head with a 2x4 and saying, you want to win elections, we have these rules for how they're held, the Electoral College, single-member district. You want to win elections, maybe you should go to the place where the voters are that you need in order to win, instead of saying, I'm going to tear the temple down because, hey, I didn't win this time.
Question back here, right up here in the front.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about the lack of third parties in this country, how rare it was, and so forth. How much of that is related to the fact that we are, I don't want to say unique, but certainly in the minority, in that we allow people to win without a majority?
We allow people to what?
We allow people to win without a majority. Most other democracies require runoffs when no one gets a majority.
Some
And
do.
to what
I
extent?
wouldn't say most. I think
Well,
some
a lot do, yeah.
Mexico doesn't.
Yeah.
Brazil does.
But
I mean,
many
there's
do.
difference.
Many do. And
Canada-
how much does this inhibit?
Canada, we just saw the party that has the is going to continue in government that got fewer popular votes than the party that lost,
Oh, okay, yeah.
because they didn't get the right number of seats. In this case, it was the party more to the left that was the beneficiary, and the party of the right, which gets these huge majorities in the prairie provinces, was the non-beneficiary. No, I mean, I think.
I mean,
well,
yeah,
the
this happens, but-
electoral college tends to give us a majority, right?
Well, no,
That's one
because
of the arguments for the
you allow-
Electoral College.
You allow a candidate to win a state's votes without a majority, And to what extent does that prevent third parties from competing in that
Well, I
state,
think,
for
I think the
example?
answer is that it pretty clearly has played a role in preventing third parties from competing, and the voter says, why should I throw away my vote? This candidate's getting 10% in the polls, and, you know,
Right.
I'm gonna pick the winner. You know, but I think, as I said, I think there's something also fundamental about the character of our government, of our parties, and of the Electoral College. You know, the Clinton campaign didn't fail to carry the Electoral College because they didn't know that there was an Electoral College. Gee, did somebody find that? And, you know, it's in the Constitution. They knew about it. They were trying to get 270 electoral votes. They failed.
So I'll dissent a little bit from the idea that the failure to have runoffs hurts third parties, because we actually do have states where they have runoff elections for Congress: Louisiana, California, Washington. I mean, California has 53 of these
California,
elections,
yep.
and we don't see third parties winning, so I don't
Right.
think it matters
And
at all.
some third parties, I can remember having breakfast at the Hotel Adlon in Berlin, and at one of the next tables was a man named Hans-Dietrich Genscher. Hans-Dietrich Genscher was arguably the most politically powerful people in the German Federal Republic. He was the head of the Free Democrats Party, which for 20 years got about 5 or 6% of the popular vote. And he decided personally whether the Christian Democrats or the Social Democrats would have the premiership. And he got to be foreign minister for 20 years on 5 or 6% of the votes. I mean, I guess Mr. Genscher was a pretty decent guy, but hey, that doesn't really seem like, you know, God's best system.
One final question in the back, Justice Williams.
I just wanted to ask if someone whose thoughts are not at all representative of a particular party can get that party's nomination for president, does that speak ill of the prospects of the parties playing a powerful role in the future?
Well, you know, we had Donald Trump not endorsed by the previous Republican presidential nominees or by the previous Republican president, except for Bob Dole did endorse him. You know, you look back to William Jennings Bryan in 1896, the incumbent Democratic president did not endorse the 36-year-old former Nebraska congressman for president. He was for McKinley. That kind of break can be damaging to a party, and people will say, you know, hey, Donald Trump only got 46% of the popular vote, and yeah, the Electoral College split his way, but it was real close in 3 essential states. It's a risk to a party when it shifts like that, I think.
Right.
But it's not there. Let me just say in conclusion, I was struck by all 3 panelists' comments about the texture that we may or may not be losing, about the idea. They fortify my long-term thoughts that politics has divided Americans more often along cultural lines than along economic lines. That's something I've believed for ever and ever, as far as I know. And I just relate it to my comment about the 1954 election in Ward 22, Precinct 221, which after that, my mother explained to me that the Catholics tend to vote more often for the Democrats and Protestants tend to vote more often for the Republicans. And I can remember at 10 years old thinking, why should this be so? And I've been trying to answer questions like that for the rest of my life. So,
Thank you. Please join me in thanking
Thank
Michael
you.
and the panel. And join us for a glass of wine.
well, I got Hans-Dietrich Genscher in there.
I was going to say,
Sure.
that was wonderful.